Manul led the old woman along the mountain paths for 4 hours. The denouement of the story will move you to tears. What would make an 80-year-old woman go out into a blizzard, into the heart of the icy mountains? No one had yet asked this question, but the answer was already making its way along the narrow, snow-covered path. Anna Petrovna Volkova, whose figure seemed as fragile as a dry branch in the wind, stubbornly put one foot in front of the other. The wind tore the featherweight scarf from her head and ruffled her gray hair. 10 meters ahead of her, a shadow moved. It was stocky, thick-coated, with a flat, angry muzzle and incredible, piercing yellow eyes. A wild cat. It did not run, but walked with the imposing confidence of the master of these places. From time to time it stopped, turned around, and its gaze, devoid of fear or aggression, met Anna Petrovna's. In that gaze she thought she saw a silent invitation, or an order. She took a worn leather pouch from the pocket of her old coat, clutched it in her numb fingers, and whispered into the blizzard, "I'm coming, Fedya. I'm coming." The cat snorted as if it had heard her and continued on its way up, where the rocks merged with the gray, heavy sky. Before we continue, let us know what city you are from. We are interested in knowing where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's begin. At the same time, an old SUV was racing along the icy road to the village of Kamenaya Pad. Igor was behind the wheel, 30 years old, wearing a fashionable city jacket clearly unsuited for the Siberian winter, his face frozen in anxiety. He hadn't been here for 3 years. Work, projects, a constant lack of time, a phone call from his neighbor, Baba Shura, short and panicked. "Yegorushka, Anna Petrovna hasn't answered since yesterday. There's no smoke coming from the chimney." These words stuck in his throat like an icy lump. He rushed out of the city, breaking every rule imaginable. But the road took 6 precious hours. The village greeted him with deafening silence and snowdrifts up to his waist. His grandmother's house stood cold and dead. Yegor's heart sank. He pushed the unlocked door open. Inside, it was freezing cold. The stove had long since gone out. On the kitchen table, pressed down with a glass, lay a note written in familiar, trembling handwriting. "Don't look for me. I went to him." To whom? Yegor's father had died long ago, and he had never known his grandfather. He had disappeared in the mountains long before Yegor was born. To him. A chill ran down Yegor's spine, unrelated to the temperature in the house. The emergency services base in the district center was a small, single-story building. Inside, it smelled of strong tea, cheap cigarettes, and anxiety. Yegor stammered as he tried to explain the situation to the officer on duty. The officer listened, nodded, and then called his boss. Boris Ignatievich emerged from behind the door. 55 years old, his face weather-beaten and red. His eyes seemed to have seen everything and long since ceased to be surprised by anything. He glanced at Yegor, making him feel uncomfortable. It was a look that said, "Another city alarmist." Boris listened to Yegor's confused story and looked at the note. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Age?" he asked curtly. 80, Yegor managed to say. Boris sighed heavily and looked out the window at the blizzard. "The temperature is -25. Wind gusts are up to 20 meters per second. Visibility on the slopes is 30 meters. The woman is 80 years old. Do you understand, kid?" Boris's words were calm, but this calmness only made Yegor more frightened. "You must. You have to look for her. She's my grandmother." Yegor's voice broke into a cry. Boris Ignatievich slowly turned his tired gaze to him. We have to. Get some people together, he said over his shoulder to the young rescuer. And find this one some warmer clothes. If he comes with us in that, we'll be looking for 2 bodies. The trail grew steeper. Anna Petrovna was breathing heavily, wheezing. Every step was painful throughout her body. She knew this trail. 50 years ago, she had walked here with her Fyodor. He was a geologist, obsessed with mountains. He said that mountains were living organisms that breathed, changed, and kept secrets. She remembered his laughter, his strong hands, his eyes shining with excitement. Look, Anya, he would say, showing her a seemingly unremarkable rock. This isn't just a cobblestone. It's the heart of the mountain. It contains its entire history. Now she was following in his footsteps, and a strange guide was leading her. A Manul, which she had named Pallas, after the scientist who first described these amazing cats. You'll take me there, won't you, Pallas? She whispered when the cat reappeared on the ridge. You know the way. Fedya is waiting. The animal just looked at her, then disappeared, only to reappear a few minutes later, a little further away, a little higher, pointing the way. It seemed like madness. But for Anna Petrovna, there was more logic in this madness than in all the years she had lived without her husband. The rescue team on 2 Burin snowmobiles set off for the foot of the ridge. Yegor sat behind a young female rescuer named Olya. She was the only one on the team who looked at him with sympathy rather than professional cynicism. Boris rode the front snowmobile, navigating by map and instinct. We'll search along the old geological trail. If the old woman is in her right mind, she'll follow it. If not, we won't find her, Boris shouted over the roar of the engine. Yegor clung to the seat handles. Every word from his boss hit him like a blow. She's not crazy, he shouted back, but his words were drowned out by the howling wind. Olya turned around. Don't listen to him. Boris Ignatievich is always like this. He's just seen too much, she said calmly, her voice giving him a glimmer of hope. They stopped at the beginning of the trail. From there, they would have to go on foot. The snow blinded their eyes. The wind knocked them off their feet. Work in pairs. Visibility is poor. Don't spread out. 2 hours to search. Then we'll come back. That's an order, Boris commanded. He looked at Yegor. You stay here. You'll just get in the way. I'm going, Yegor said firmly, meeting his boss's gaze. I'm not staying. It's my grandmother. Something like respect flashed in Boris's eyes for a second. He nodded silently and stepped onto the trail first. Anna Petrovna fell. Her strength left her. She lay face down in the snow, and the cold began to seep under her old coat, numbing her body. She couldn't go on. 50 years of waiting, and this was how it ended. Just freeze to death a few hours' walk from home. She closed her eyes. The image of Fyodor appeared before her inner vision. He smiled at her and held out his hand. Almost, Anya, almost, his voice whispered. She opened her eyes. Right in front of her face sat Manul. He didn't move. He just stared at her with his huge, unblinking eyes. There was no pity or malice in them, only a primitive, wild calm. He tilted his flat head, snorted, and a stream of steam escaped from his nostrils. Then he slowly turned around and took a few steps up the slope. He turned back again. He waited. Anna Petrovna looked at him, and suddenly she understood. This was not a hallucination. This was not the delirium of a dying mind. This was a test, the last one. She forced herself to move. She dug her numb hands into the snow. She groaned from the pain and effort. And she stood up. Staggering, she took a step, then another. I'm coming, she croaked. and man moved again, leading her further and further into the white mist. Almost 2 hours passed. 2 hours of desperate searching, of cries that were instantly swallowed up by the blizzard. The group walked several kilometers along the trail, but found nothing. Not a trace, not a scrap of fabric, not a single sign. The snow was falling in sheets. It was becoming obvious that the operation had failed. Boris stopped the group at a small rocky outcrop that offered at least some protection from the wind. The rescuers' faces were covered with frost. Everyone was tired and frozen. That's it. Boris's voice was firm and unyielding. He looked at his watch, then at the sky. Let's get going. We won't find her. I'm not going to risk people's lives in this weather. It's over. To Yegor, these words sounded like a death sentence. Something inside him snapped. No, please, just a little longer. We had to find something. He grabbed Boris by the sleeve. Boris shook his hand off harshly. This is the mountains, kid, not a city park. They don't forgive mistakes or sentimentality. The operation is over. Yegor recoiled as if from a blow. A feeling of guilt and helplessness overwhelmed him. He threw his head back and screamed into the white sky, putting all his pain and despair into that cry. Grandma! The wind caught his cry and carried it away, leaving not even an echo. And at that moment, when Yegor's cry dissolved in the howling wind, when all hope seemed lost, Olya let out a quiet gasp. Look, she whispered, pointing to a rocky ledge high above them. Everyone looked up. There, on the very edge, clearly visible against the gray sky, sat a motionless figure. Small, stocky, with an unnaturally serious expression. Manul. The wildcat sat and stared straight at them. Not at Yegor, not at Olya, but at the whole group. There was no fear in his posture, only a waiting calm. It's him, Yegor whispered. It's the cat the neighbor was talking about. She saw the old woman go after him. Boris Ignatievich narrowed his eyes. His experience told him that this was just a wild animal, a coincidence. But something about this scene was wrong. Wild Manuls are terrified of people. They would never show themselves so openly, especially to a group. Coincidence, he said, though his voice no longer had its former confidence. He's waiting, Yegor almost shouted. He led us here. Please, Boris Ignatievich, one more push. There, toward him. Boris was silent. He looked at the cat, then at Yegor's desperate, pleading face, then at his exhausted men. All his logic, all his years of experience were against this idea. Going upstairs, into the blizzard, after a wild animal was the height of unprofessionalism. It was stupidity that could kill in the mountains. But the cat didn't leave. It just sat there and watched, as if challenging them. Boris Ignatievich, Olya said quietly. We're already here. 10 minutes won't make a difference. What if something happens? There was more than just girlish empathy in her voice. There was the logic of a rescuer. Check every chance, even the craziest one. Boris cursed under his breath. Something primitive and illogical was fighting his professional cynicism. He looked at the ledge one last time. Okay, he spat out. 5 minutes. We're going in there. But if it's empty, we're out of here. No arguments. Got it? Yegor nodded, unable to utter a word. He was ready for anything. The group, watching each other's backs, began the difficult climb up the icy slope to the ledge where their mysterious guide awaited them. The climb took almost 15 minutes. The wind up here was even worse. It blew icy flakes into their faces, trying to knock them off their feet. When they finally scrambled onto the ledge, it was empty. Manul had disappeared. He had vanished as if he had never been there. "I told you, he's just an animal," Boris shouted, his voice full of malicious triumph. He was right. His experience had not failed him. He had risked people's lives for nothing. "Turn back, immediately." Yegor stood in the middle of the ledge, devastated. The hope that had flashed so brightly had faded, leaving only bitter ashes behind. He was ready to burst into tears from helplessness. But Olya, who was examining the site, suddenly froze. "Wait," she called. "Over here." They approached. At the very edge of the cliff, where the snow almost completely covered the base, a chain of footprints was visible. Small, cat-like. The tracks led straight to a narrow, almost invisible black crack in the rock. The crevice was so filled with snow that from the side it looked like a shadow on the rock. "Fresh," one of the rescuers said, crouching down. He went in there. Boris Ignatievich approached the crack. He shook his head in disbelief. A fox's den, or a badger's, anything. But obeying his professional duty, he took the powerful flashlight from his shoulder and directed the beam into the darkness. The crack turned out to be the entrance to a small cave, a grotto no bigger than a closet. At first, the beam revealed only bare, frozen walls. Boris was about to turn off the flashlight when suddenly the beam slid lower and froze. On the floor of the cave, curled up and covered with snow like a blanket, lay a human figure. "I found her." Boris's cry was sharp and businesslike. "She's here." He squeezed into the cave first. Yegor rushed after him. Anna Petrovna lay motionless. Her face was as white as the snow around her. Her lips were blue. She didn't seem to be breathing. Boris put his fingers to her neck, feeling for a pulse. The seconds dragged on like an eternity. "She's alive," he gasped. "Her pulse is weak, but it's there. Quick, get a stretcher, a thermal blanket, and something hot to drink. Hurry!" Yegor collapsed to his knees next to his grandmother. He looked at her face, at the frost on her eyelashes, and tears streamed down his cheeks, freezing in the cold. She was alive. They had made it. In her hand, even in her unconscious state, clenched so tightly that her fingers were white, was that same old leather pouch. He tried to gently pry her hand open, but her fingers wouldn't budge. She was holding on to her treasure with a death grip. The rescuers worked quickly and efficiently. They carefully transferred Anna Petrovna to a stretcher and wrapped her in a special foil blanket that would keep her warm. The long and dangerous descent to the snowmobiles began. Now they were fighting not against the unknown, but against time. Every minute of hypothermia reduced their chances. Boris Ignatievich walked ahead, choosing the safest route, his face focused and stern. But there was no cynicism in his eyes anymore. There was the excitement of a professional who had snatched his prey from the clutches of death. In the rescue camp tent, a generator hummed and a lamp burned brightly. It was warm and smelled of medicine. Anna Petrovna was hooked up to an IV with a warm solution. Olya gently wiped her face and hands. Yegor sat nearby, never taking his eyes off his grandmother, holding her hand. Gradually, Anna Petrovna's cheeks began to turn pink, and her breathing became more even. She moaned and opened her eyes. Her cloudy gaze swept around the tent and stopped on Yegor. "Pallas," she whispered so softly that Yegor could barely hear her. "He brought him." "Hush, grandmother, hush. Everything is fine. We are safe." Yegor stroked her hand. He decided she was delirious. Her fingers finally relaxed, and the old tobacco pouch fell onto the blanket. Yegor picked it up. The ties were wet and loose. He pulled them, and the pouch opened. Its contents spilled onto the blanket. Yegor stared at it in bewilderment. A handful of completely unremarkable, dirty gray-black stones, resembling ordinary gravel. A faded black-and-white photograph of a young man with an open smile. And a tiny lock of light-colored children's hair tied with a thread. That was all. Was that why she had almost died? Because of a handful of trash and an old photograph? Boris Ignatievich, who had just entered the tent to check on the rescued woman, stopped. His gaze fell on the stones. He came closer, frowning. Something about them seemed familiar. He reached out and picked up the largest stone. It was unusually heavy for its size. In his youth, before serving in the Ministry of Emergency Situations, Boris had worked as a geologist for several years. Old memories stirred within him. He took his powerful flashlight out of his pocket, the same one he had found Anna Petrovna in the cave. He turned it on and directed a narrow, bright beam at the stone in his palm. The stone did not simply reflect the light. At a certain angle, a distinct, rich, noble metallic sheen appeared on its fracture. Boris's face slowly stretched out. He shifted his stunned gaze from the stone to Yegor, who was still looking at him in bewilderment. A ringing silence hung in the tent, broken only by the steady hum of the generator. "Young man," Boris said slowly, deliberately, his voice sounding unusually hollow. "Do you even understand what you have in your hands?" Yegor stared blankly at the stone in Boris's hand, then at the handful of similar stones on the blanket. He didn't understand anything. He saw gray, unremarkable gravel. Boris Ignatievich saw something else. In his eyes, accustomed to tragedy and routine, burned the fire of professional excitement that Yegor could neither understand nor explain. "Platinum, kid," Boris repeated, without taking his eyes off the stone. "Or something from its group. Rhodium, palladium, unprocessed ore. But judging by the weight and shine, that's what it is. A real treasure. A nugget like this is worth a fortune. And if it's a vein, then we're talking about a state-scale deposit." The words fortune and deposit did not fit in Yegor's mind with the image of his grandmother. A frail, quiet old woman who had lived her whole life in poverty, mending old clothes and growing potatoes in her garden. "What platinum?" he finally managed to say. "Why does she need it? She almost died because of those stones." "He found it, Yegorushka." Anna Petrovna's faint whisper made both men turn around. She looked at them meaningfully, tears welling up in her eyes. "Your grandfather, Fyodor. He found it after all." She raised herself up on her elbows with an effort. "It's not because of greed, granddaughter. It's justice." Boris carefully put the stone back on the blanket and pushed a mug of warm tea toward Anna Petrovna. "Tell us, Anna Petrovna, if you can. What did your husband find?" Anna Petrovna took a small sip. Her gaze wandered into the distance, through the canvas walls of the tent, through the 50 years that separated her from that fateful day. "Fyodor had a partner, Stepan. We were from the same village. He had envious eyes and greedy hands. Fyodor trusted him like himself. They went on that expedition together, their last one." She fell silent, catching her breath. Yegor listened, holding his breath. He had always known the official version. His grandfather, a geologist, had fallen off a cliff during a snowstorm. An accident. A tragic but simple story. "They were looking for copper," Anna Petrovna continued. "But Fedya was secretly testing one of his theories. He was sure that there was something more valuable in this ridge. And he found it. This." She nodded toward the stones. He managed to pass me a note with the last traveler who met them at the foot of the ridge. He wrote that he was on the verge of a great discovery and would return soon. 3 days later, Stepan returned. Alone. He said that Fedya had slipped on the ledge, that there had been a blizzard, a snowstorm. They couldn't find the body. A heavy silence hung in the tent. Boris Ignatievich looked at Anna Petrovna with a tense, heavy gaze. He already guessed where the story was going. I didn't believe him. Anna Petrovna's voice grew stronger, ringing with metal. Not for a second. I saw his eyes. He wasn't grieving. He was triumphant. Then he left the village and quickly got rich somewhere up north in the mines. People said he was just lucky. She clenched her fists. But I knew that his luck had stayed here, in these mountains. My Fedya was an experienced climber. He couldn't have just slipped. Stepan? He helped him fall. This simple, terrible confession took Yegor's breath away. In an instant, his family's story ceased to be tragic. It became monstrous. His grandfather had been murdered because of those gray stones. But why did you keep quiet? Why didn't you go to the police? Yegor asked. What could I have told them? Anna Petrovna smiled bitterly. That I didn't like his partner's eyes? I had no proof, nothing. I knew that Fedya must have hidden the samples in the map somewhere. He was smart. He must have sensed something was wrong. I searched. My whole life. I studied his papers, walked the trails until I had no strength left. But the mountains kept their secret. Boris Ignatievich took an old photograph from the blanket. A young, smiling geologist, Fyodor Volkov, looked at him from the past. Next to the photograph lay a tiny, almost weightless lock of a child's hair. Boris looked at Anna Petrovna with a silent question. He thought that the story had reached its climax. What could be worse than murder and betrayal? He did not yet know that he had only just reached the edge of a real abyss. Yegor also noticed the lock of hair. He had always known that his father, Anna and Fyodor's only child, had dark hair. This lock was light, almost white. "Grandma, whose is this?" he asked cautiously. Anna Petrovna looked at the tiny curl, and her face contorted with such pain that Yegor became frightened. 2 tears slowly rolled down her wrinkled cheeks. She looked at Yegor, and her eyes reflected all the darkness and cold of these mountains. "Stepan didn't just take Fyodor," she whispered, and her whisper sounded louder than a scream. "Fyodor wasn't alone in the mountains that day. He took our firstborn with him, 5-year-old Alyosha, your uncle." The silence in the tent turned into a deafening vacuum. Anna Petrovna's words fell into this silence like stones into a bottomless well. Yegor looked at his grandmother, unable to comprehend what he had heard. He had an uncle? A 5-year-old boy. He had never heard of him. Not a single word, not a single photograph in the house. It was as if he had never existed. Boris Ignatievich, a man who had seen death in dozens of its guises, froze, holding the photograph and the lock of hair in his hands. His usually impenetrable face turned into a mask of shock. He slowly placed the evidence of the past on the blanket, as if it were burning his fingers. Stepan came back and said that Fedya was alone. Anna Petrovna continued in a mechanical, lifeless voice, staring at a single point. That he had persuaded him to leave the child downstairs in the winter hut. I believed him. How could I not believe him? Who in their right mind would leave a child to freeze to death in the mountains? She fell silent, breathing heavily. Olya, who had been standing in the corner of the tent, quietly approached and sat down next to Anna Petrovna, gently taking her hand. When they didn't find Fedya, I rushed to the winter hut. It was empty. I searched for Alyosha for a week. The whole village searched. We thought maybe he was scared and went into the forest, got lost. But we didn't find him. Not a trace. Then the police decided that a bear had dragged him away. The case was closed. Every word was torture for her. She was pulling out the splinters that had been stuck in her heart for 50 years. But I knew it wasn't a bear. It was Stepan. He didn't just kill my husband. He left my son to die in the mountains. So there would be no witnesses. So that no one would ever know that Fedya wasn't alone. Yegor covered his face with his hands. The picture painted by the grandmother's words was so horrific that his brain refused to accept it. A little boy left in a snowy desert, alone, in the cold. He imagined his fear, his tears, his cries that no one answered, and all because of a handful of gray stones. But this lock of hair, where did it come from? Boris's voice was hoarse. Fyodor cut it off this morning before he left. Anna Petrovna touched the light strands with her finger. Alyosha had just recovered from an illness, and I didn't want to let him go. But Fedya laughed and said that the mountain air would do him good. He cut off the lock of hair as a keepsake. He said, "Look, Anya, our little son." He put it in his tobacco pouch, along with a photograph. That pouch, it's all I have left of them. I knew it was somewhere here, in the place where it all ended. I had to find it, take it home. Now everything fell into place. The desperate departure in the blizzard, the conversations with an invisible interlocutor, the certainty that she was being led. It wasn't senile madness. It was a mother's and a widow's duty, the last ritual she had to perform before she died. That cat, Manul, whispered Yegor. You named him Pallas. You said he brought you here. Anna Petrovna smiled faintly. Fyodor called them stone cats. He said they weren't just animals, but mountain spirits, guardians. When I saw him at the house, I knew right away. He had come for me, to show me the way, the spirit of my husband or my boy. Or maybe the mountains took pity on me. What difference does it make now? He led me to the place where Fedya had hidden his tobacco pouch, to the very cave where they probably took shelter from the weather before everything. She looked at Boris. There's a map there, in the pouch, under the lining. Fedya always did that. A map of that very place. Boris Ignatievich took the leather pouch. He carefully felt around the bottom and came across a thickening. He carefully cut the seam with his knife. From under the worn leather lining appeared a yellowed piece of tracing paper folded several times. Unfolding it, Boris saw a hand-drawn geological map of a small section of the ridge. A cross marked the spot, the cave where they had found Anna Petrovna, and next to it was a bold arrow and a pencil inscription. Main vein, 200 meters northwest of the grotto. This was not just a treasure map. It was proof, irrefutable proof. A map drawn by Fyodor Volkov himself, hidden along with samples of ore and personal belongings in the place where he was last seen alive. Together with Anna Petrovna's story, it turned into a murder case, a double murder. Stepan, asked Yegor. Is he alive? He's alive, Anna Petrovna said firmly. I've been watching him all these years. He's a big man now, a coal magnate. He lives in Moscow. His name is now Stepan Ignatievich Vlasov. He changed his surname long ago so that his past wouldn't catch up with him. Boris Ignatievich slowly folded the map. He looked at Anna Petrovna, then at Yegor. There was no trace of cynicism in his eyes. only the cold fury of a professional confronted with absolute evil. "The past always catches up," he said curtly, "especially when people like us come after it." He left the tent without saying another word. A minute later, his voice could be heard outside, giving orders over a satellite phone. He spoke of the need for urgent evacuation by helicopter, of the condition of the victim, of newly discovered circumstances in a 50-year-old case. Yegor was left alone with the old woman. He looked at her exhausted but peaceful face. She had done what she had to do. She had given her men back their names and their stories back to them. "Grandma, rest," he said quietly. "Now it's my turn." Anna Petrovna closed her eyes, and for the first time in half a century, a semblance of a peaceful smile appeared on her face. She knew that now she was not alone. The chain that had bound her family for 50 years was beginning to break. Revenge, cold as mountain ice and inevitable as an avalanche, was set in motion. And it was set in motion by a frail 80-year-old woman who had been led through a blizzard by a wild stone cat. The helicopter arrived at dawn. Its roar shattered the morning silence of the mountains. Anna Petrovna and Yegor were evacuated to the district hospital. Boris Ignatievich remained at the base. The evidence remained with him: stones, a photograph, a child's lock of hair, and a map. Before taking off, he approached Yegor. "I will personally oversee this case," he said, his voice steely. "This Vlasov will answer for everything. I promise you." Yegor silently shook his strong, weather-beaten hand. As the helicopter gained altitude, Yegor looked out the window at the snow-covered peaks. The mountains that had taken his grandfather and uncle from him had now given him back their history. And somewhere out there, on one of the rocky ledges, he was sure, sat a lone Manul, watching them go, the keeper of the secret, a silent witness who had waited 50 long winters for his moment. But the story was far from over. In Moscow, in his luxurious office, 75-year-old coal magnate Stepan Ignatievich Vlasov did not yet know that echoes from the distant past were already flying towards him, ready to strike with all their deadly force. The news of the discovery in the Siberian taiga did not become a national sensation. Boris Ignatievich had made sure of that. The information was leaked to the media in small doses and in a dry manner. During a rescue operation, the remains of a geological expedition from the mid-20th century were discovered. An investigation is underway. But for one man in Moscow, those few lines in the newsfeed sounded louder than a death knell. Stepan Ignatievich Vlasov, a 75-year-old coal empire owner, sat in his panoramic office on the 40th floor and felt the icy cold he had left in the mountains 50 years ago finally reach him. He didn't know the details. He didn't know what exactly had been found. But he knew that the past he had so carefully buried was beginning to stir beneath the thick layer of time. His confidence, built on money and power, cracked for the first time in half a century. He became irritable and suspicious, checking the news every hour and lashing out at his subordinates. A predator who had never feared anyone in his entire life suddenly felt like prey. At that moment, in a quiet ward of the district hospital, Anna Petrovna was slowly coming back to life. Yegor was always by her side. He told her about his life in the city, his work, and his plans, which now seemed petty and insignificant to him. He looked at his grandmother and saw not just a frail old woman, but a titan who had carried an unbearable burden throughout her life and never broken. Boris Ignatievich acted with the cold efficiency of an avalanche. The ore samples sent to Moscow were examined in record time. The verdict was unequivocal: platinum of the highest purity. The map, Fyodor Volkov's handwriting, his personal belongings, All this formed an irrefutable chain of evidence. The case was taken out of the archives and handed over to the investigative committee. Boris, using his old connections, became the chief consultant on the case, its unofficial driving force. He was transformed from a weary rescuer into an obsessed avenger. One morning, Yegor entered the ward and saw that his grandmother was looking at him with a clear, meaningful gaze. "I'm going to Moscow, Grandma," he said quietly. "I have to look him in the eye." Anna Petrovna did not try to dissuade him. She just held out her weak, wrinkled hand and squeezed his palm. That squeeze held all her faith, all her hope. She was passing the torch. Her war was over. Now his was beginning. It was almost impossible to arrange a meeting with a tycoon of Vlasov's caliber. But Yegor found a way. He called the receptionist and introduced himself as the son of one of the old geologists who had found his father's papers concerning the Siberian deposits. The greed that had once driven Stepan to murder was now at work again. Vlasov, tormented by uncertainty, agreed to a short meeting. He wanted to understand exactly what they knew. Vlasov's office was striking in its cold luxury. A huge blackwood desk, panoramic windows overlooking the whole of Moscow, everything in perfect order. The owner of the office, a fit man with a stern, authoritative face, looked at Yegor with a piercing, appraising gaze. "Speak, young man. I don't have much time," he said. Yegor sat down opposite him. He felt no fear, only icy calm. He had not come to threaten or demand anything. He had come to repay a debt. "I have come from Siberia, Stepan Ignatievich," Yegor began in an even voice. "From the village of Kamenaya Pad." At the name of the village, Vlasov flinched slightly. "I am here on behalf of my grandmother, Anna Petrovna Volkova." Vlasov froze. His fingers resting on the tabletop, clenched into fists. "I don't know anyone by that name," he managed to say. "You know her," Yegor replied gently. "You also knew her husband, the geologist Fyodor Volkov." Yegor laid a faded photograph on the table. A smiling Fyodor looked at his killer. "My grandmother searched for him for 50 years. Yegor continued in the same tone of voice. "And she found him. She found the cave where he left a note for her." Vlasov was silent. His face turned gray. He stared at the photograph as if it were a ghost. "She found the samples he had collected. She found his map. And she told me everything. About how you went to the mountains together, and how you came back alone." "That's a lie. Slander," Vlasov exploded. "It was an accident. He fell." "Yes," Yegor nodded. "That's what you told everyone. But you forgot one detail. You said that Fyodor was alone. And that's not true." Yegor paused, looking straight into Vlasov's eyes. And then he delivered the final, decisive blow. His son was with him, 5-year-old Alyosha, my uncle. The boy had very light, almost white hair, like the sun my grandmother still remembers. At that moment, the mask slipped from Vlasov's face. The mention of the boy, the color of his hair, details that only he, the killer, could have known, broke him. His face contorted in a grimace of horror and rage. He jumped up, knocking over his chair. "What do you want? Money? How much? I'll give you as much as you want. Just shut up." It was a confession, complete and unconditional. At that moment, the office door burst open. Boris Ignatievich stood in the doorway, accompanied by 2 plainclothes officers. He looked at Vlasov without hatred, with the cold satisfaction of a surgeon who had removed a tumor. "Hello, Stepan," Boris said quietly. "The past has come for you." The denouement was swift. The news channels exploded. Coal magnate Stepan Vlasov has been arrested on charges of double murder committed 50 years ago. His empire began to collapse like a house of cards. Yegor returned to the hospital. He entered the ward and sat down next to his grandmother. "It's over, Grandma," he said. "Justice has prevailed." Anna Petrovna opened her eyes, looked at her grandson, and her gaze was filled with endless gratitude and peace. She squeezed his hand weakly, smiled, and closed her eyes. Her heart stopped beating. She passed away quietly and peacefully, having fulfilled her duty and seen justice done. Yegor did not return to Moscow. He buried his grandmother next to the empty grave she had once dug for her son Fyodor and grandson Alyosha. He stayed in her old house, looking at the mountains, which no longer seemed foreign and hostile to him. They were part of his history. The wealth hidden in their depths went to the state. But Yegor gained something more: himself. The story has come to an end, but the main question remains open. What do you think was the real punishment for Vlasov? Life imprisonment, or the fact that the truth about his child's death became public knowledge?